Is there anything the US government can do to stop rampant inflation in the country? Reducing inflation doesn't mean go back to lower prices. It means stopping the price increases. You can have zero inflation and still have the prices we see today. Any sliver of hope that the elected government can do anything to put a stop to, slow down this choking inflation. If you are in the US, then more than a sliver of hope. The raising interest rate hikes along with continued return to supply chain has got inflation back down to historic averages. The average inflation rate of the last 50 years is 5%. And the current rate is 3.9%. So actually a bit below average. The target is about 3%. So there is some room to go. But the period of radical inflation of the previous 2 years seems to be over. But it doesn't feel better. Why? Remember that inflation is just year-to-year rise. Not how much more expensive are things today compared to some correct rate. So if inflation was 10% last year and 3% this year, that doesn't mean things are cheaper this year than last. It just means prices didn't go up as much this year as they went up last. So average prices are likely never going to be the same as they were in 2016, just as prices in 2016 were never going to be as low as in 2000. And prices in 2000 were never going to be as low as they were in 1990. Also, different things adjust in different ways. So if you are house hunting right now, that is still going up a lot. If you are buying eggs, those egg prices actually have largely dropped back to prices very similar to prior years. Since not only inflation was impacting those, also, prices going up are more salient to our brain than them going down. Speaking of eggs, when those prices spiked, you saw hundreds of Facebook posts about, "Look at prices of eggs in my store." This meant even if you weren't buying them, you were getting hit with that general anxiety. But when egg prices stabilized and fell, you didn't see 100 posts saying, "Reasonable prices." Quote, "Part of this is political. There are motivated reasonings to the kind of headlines different publications push depending on who is in office. But part is just very human. Pain is salient. Something that hurts catches our eye more than something going back to normal." I'd say one last thing that can impact is what we compare to. Pre-pandemic, there was a price battle between OPEC and Ruasia on gas prices that drove gas prices unusually low. Then a pandemic that drove gas prices unusually low. Then a war in Ukraine, and coming out of the pandemic, an inflation that spiked gas prices. And to a large extent that has settled back into a more normal pattern. But it is easy to compare to that unusual lull rather than the historic trajectory. Inflation is the same. We were just coming out of a period of ridiculously low inflation for like a decade. Which is why interest rates were ridiculously low for the same period. Then they both spiked. But as they settle back down to more average numbers, they are going to feel high because a decade is a long time to get used to something and set expectations. And even typical numbers can feel high in comparison. Anyways, that was likely way more than you wanted. And may or may not have been helpful. But yes, at least in the US, inflation has actually fallen, at least currently, to below historic norms, but still a bit higher than target. That doesn't mean that prices will go down. It just means they are back to rising at a slower rate. Some prices have actually gone down if there were other specific factors pushing them in a certain direction. But overall, you shouldn't think of inflation under control as prices and salaries returning to some specific state from the past, but as them slowing their climb as they always do. They've actually done a great job stopping inflation. The problem is, the inflation already happened. It's slowed to a crawl. But no deflation has occurred. So it doesn't feel like any progress has been made. Raise short-term banking interest rates, just like they did, and counter it with increased infrastructure spending to keep employment from dropping, just like they did. It's frigging annoying and hurts the middle class. But it has dropped the inflation from 10% to 3%. Not trying to be funny, but they literally passed the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. Since when inflation has reduced from 9.1% to 3.8%. Source: of course, that's still higher than desirable. And inflation doesn't affect all prices and families equally. Inflation is a worldwide issue right now, my friend. Not specific to the US. Small comfort for you, but it's affecting us all globally. Start taxing corporations more heavily on windfall profits. If their margins suddenly shoot up, make them pay more. You know, the way it used to work. Before corporations bought every politician in the nation? It went down in the last year. If you didn't notice, I'm truly sorry for your situation and hope things improve. Inflation has slowed. Too bad no one's wages are keeping pace. Prices aren't going to go down. We need big hikes to the minimum wage. Not really. If inflation were directly related to government spending, then someone has to explain why during 20,132,021 there was no inflation. Interest rates went down through the whole period and government dumped money while the Fed did K. People hear inflation is directly related to spending, but it's obvious it's more complicated than just dollars in or out of the system. That said, it won't matter who is elected because the president has zero control over this. Choking inflation? Inflation has dropped from 9% to less than 4%. Not sure what your definition of choking inflation is. The Fed has been taking action. Really the only tool in the box. Plus, US inflation is significantly lower than most of the rest of the world. Have to remember a good chunk of the increased costs at the grocery store, rent, and other day-to-day expenses are not controlled by the feds. Policies are in place that have greatly reduced inflation, but opportunism and greed has driven a lot of the cost increases. Lot of companies on record for raising costs far higher than inflation rate or increased raw material or even fuel costs would have justified. They took the opportunity to blame inflation while many making money hand over fist. Congress could. But why should they? They campaigned on solving inflation, the price of eggs and milk, and the price of gas, fixing the supply chain after COVID disruptions. They wouldn't even agree on $35 insulin for all. For seniors was barely passed. Corporations are making a killing and buying yachts for their yachts while workers are not being compensated near that level. Federal minimum wage not raised. People can't wait to vote for these grifters again. They have watched the Chaos Sedition Caucus the past year not pass any meaningful legislation to help the cost of groceries, insurance, gas, or anything else. Record corporate profits. Does government control corporations? Do people hold corporations accountable? There's your answer. This isn't created by government. Again, record profits. Much of the inflation is due to corporate greed and price gouging. The simple answer is tell corporations to lower prices or they will be taxed harder on their profits. Corporations are posting record profits. It could pass laws cracking down on profit margin-related inflation, aka greedflation. Impose a windfall profits tax on profit earned in that way. It will never happen, since corporations are the owners of the government. People see prices as the key indicator of inflation. Prices are determined by companies that seek to maximize profit. Companies will not be lowering prices anytime soon and raised prices because of inflation. Those same companies are posting record profits. As many have mentioned, the primary level to control inflation is interest rates. Those Fed actions seem to be moving the needle as intended. As for how we got here, and global perspective, my take is coming out of COVID, people had been saving money and were ready to spend it. That uptick in consumption, coupled with some supply issues, started to push prices. Goods suppliers and retailers realized consumers had more cash to spend and saw the opportunity to continue to raise prices, even after any supply issues were resolved. That loop is starting to run dry, and coupled with higher rates, inflation has fallen precipitously. This is also not a US-only issue. Inflation has hit globally, for many of the reasons mentioned above. As bad as it may have been here, the US currently has one of, if not the lowest inflation rates in the developed world. So, the tools available are working. It's not fast and easy to turn an aircraft carrier like the US economy, but it's working. Price controls and policies to that end are far worse than current Fed actions, and would be ruinous to us consumers and firms. Stop the rampant profiteering that is driving it. The problem is inflation is a component of our central banking system. Read about the history of central banking to better understand why any permanent solution to inflation would require upending, redefining not only banking but our entire monetary system.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epicaricast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.